Chapter 4. The next day, Kitty and Lydia came home bubbling over the news. A regiment of soldiers had arrived in the nearby village of Meryton and were to stay there all winter. The two girls were full of excitement about the handsome officers and their smart red coats, and they would talk of nothing else. I've suspected it for some time, but now I am sure, said Mr. Bennet with a heavy sigh. You are two of the silliest girls in the country. But Mrs. Bennet didn't think their interest in the officers was silly at all. I wouldn't mind if a smart young colonel wanted to marry one of my daughters, she said, adding wistfully, you know, when I was a girl, I liked a red coat myself once. Just then, a footman arrived with a note for Jane. It was from Miss Bingley, inviting Jane to dine at Netherfield Park with herself and Mrs. Hurst, while Mr. Bingley and the other gentlemen dined out with the officers. May I have the carriage? Jane asked eagerly. No, insisted Mrs. Bennet at once. You must go on horseback. It looks like rain, and if so, they will ask you to spend the night. That way you won't miss the chance to see Mr. Bingley. Sure enough, not long after Jane had set out, it began to rain very hard. What a good idea of mine, said Mrs. Bennet, as pleased as if she had made it rain herself. But at breakfast the next morning, a note arrived from Netherfield for Elizabeth. Dear Lizzie, I'm very unwell this morning. I got wet through yesterday on my ride to Netherfield, and now I have a cold. My friends will hear nothing of me returning home, but I am better, until I am better, and insist on sending for the doctor. But don't worry. Apart from a headache and a sore throat, there's nothing much wrong with me. Jane. Well, Mrs. Bennet, said Mr. Bennet, after Elizabeth had read this aloud, if Jane should die from this illness, at least you will know it was all for Mr. Bingley's sake. Don't be silly. People don't die of little trifling colds, protested Mrs. Bennet. But just the same, Elizabeth felt worried about Jane, and made up her mind to walk over to Netherfield to see her. Mrs. Bennet did not like this idea one bit. You can't possibly walk in all this dirt. You won't be fit to be seen when you get there. I shall be fit to see Jane, which is all I want, said Elizabeth stoutly. It's only 3 miles after all. It did not take Elizabeth long to cross the fields to Netherfield. She loved walking and being outdoors. It was a pleasant day now that the rain had stopped, and she walked briskly, jumping over stiles and springing over puddles. By the time she arrived at Mr. Bingley's grand house, she had dirty stockings, but a face glowing with warmth. Everyone was surprised to see her. Mrs. Hurst and Miss Bingley could hardly believe she had walked so far. Whilst Mr. Bingley welcomed her warmly, Mr. Darcy said little, and Mr. Hurst nothing at all, because he was only interested in his breakfast. While Elizabeth went to see Jane, who was resting in the guest bedroom, down in the drawing room, Miss Bingley and Mrs. Hurst were already gossiping about her. Really, she looked almost wild. What was she thinking, scampering about the country, just because her sister has a cold? Walking 3 miles in the mud and dirt by herself? Her hair was so untidy, and her petticoat was 6 inches deep in mud, I am certain of it. I thought it was very kind of Miss Elizabeth to come all this way to see her sister, said Mr. Bingley indignantly. I didn't even notice her petticoat. You noticed it, I am sure, Mr. Darcy, said Miss Bingley slyly. I'm afraid this might affect your admiration for her fine eyes. But Mr. Darcy only shrugged. Actually, they were brightened by the exercise, was all he said. Jane was feeling very ill, so Elizabeth was relieved when Mr. Bingley insisted she stay on at Netherfield to look after her sister, sending a servant back to Longbourn to collect some of her clothes. That evening, when Jane had fallen asleep, Elizabeth came down to the drawing room. Mr. Bingley invited her to join in the card game they were playing, but she said she would rather read a book. Mr. Hurst stared at her in astonishment. "You prefer reading to cards?" he asked. "Miss Bennet despises cards," announced Miss Bingley. "She is a great reader and enjoys nothing else." Elizabeth raised her eyebrows. "Actually, I enjoy lots of things," she replied honestly. Miss Bingley only laughed her silly laugh. Soon the card game was finished. Mr. Darcy picked up a book too, but Miss Bingley turned to Elizabeth. "Miss Eliza, why don't you join me to take a stroll around the room? It is so refreshing." Miss Bingley tucked her arm through Elizabeth's as though they were best of friends, and began to parade up and down the room with her. When Mr. Darcy glanced up from his book as they passed, Miss Bingley invited him to join them too. "But surely that would destroy the point," he replied. "Whatever do you mean?" said Miss Bingley with a laugh. "Well, you are either sharing secrets with each other, in which case you wouldn't want me listening, or perhaps you want me to admire you as you walk, which I can do much better sitting here by the fire." "What a shocking thing to say!" cried Miss Bingley, pretending to be outraged. "Miss Eliza, how shall we punish him for it?" "That's easy," said Elizabeth at once. "Tease him for making such a suggestion. Laugh at him." "Nobody could possibly tease or laugh at Mr. Darcy," said Miss Bingley very seriously. "Couldn't they?" asked Elizabeth, lifting her eyebrows. "That's a shame. I love to laugh." "But there would be nothing to laugh at Mr. Darcy. He has no flaws." "Of course I do, just the same as anyone else," said Mr. Darcy stiffly. "Though I must admit I do try to avoid any weaknesses which are easily laughed at, or seem ridiculous," he added. "Such as pride, perhaps?" suggested Elizabeth in an innocent voice. "I don't think pride is a weakness," said Mr. Darcy, and Elizabeth had to turn away to hide her smile. "But I do have plenty of shortcomings. I have a hot temper, and I find it hard to forgive people. My good opinion once lost is lost forever." "That is a weakness," agreed Elizabeth, "but I can't laugh at it." "I think it's time for some music," said Miss Bingley, hurrying to the piano, not much liking this conversation in which she didn't seem to be playing any part. The next morning Mrs. Bennet arrived at Netherfield to see how Jane was getting on, bringing Kitty and Lydia with her. She was pleased to find that Jane seemed a little better, but she was not going to let Mr. Bingley know that. She wanted Jane to stay at Netherfield for as long as she could. "She is much too ill to be moved," she said, shaking her head mournfully. "We must take advantage of your kindness for a little longer." "Moved? It must not be thought of," exclaimed Mr. Bingley at once. "She will receive every possible attention," said Miss Bingley, coldly polite. Mrs. Bennet was quick to admire everything at Netherfield. "You must be so comfortable here. You would never think of going back to London." "When I am in the country I never wish to go back to London," Mr. Bingley agreed, "though I must admit when I am in town it is just the same. I am very happy in both places." but country society is rather confined and unvarying, observed Mr. Darcy. Confined? Unvarying? Exclaimed Mrs. Bennet, much offended. I'll have you know we dine with 24 families, she said, thinking this a very large and impressive number. Mr. Bingley nodded politely, but Mrs. Hurst sniggered, and Miss Bingley gave Mr. Darcy a little smirk. Elizabeth hurried to change the subject. "Has Charlotte Lucas come to visit?" she asked her mother. "She called yesterday with her father," replied Mrs. Bennet, still rather cross. "What an agreeable man Sir William is! That is my idea of a true gentleman," she said, giving Mr. Darcy a glower. "And Charlotte Lucas is a very good sort of girl, though she is rather plain. What a shame she's not as beautiful as Jane," she added, with a sidelong look at Mr. Bingley. All this time, Kitty and Lydia had been whispering to each other. Now Lydia spoke up boldly. "Mr. Bingley, didn't you say you'd give a ball at Netherfield? It would be a shame if you didn't keep your promise." "Of course I will," said Mr. Bingley cheerfully. "When your sister is better, you may name the day of the ball." Mrs. Bennet and her daughters were delighted. Soon afterwards they left, and Elizabeth returned to Jane's room, leaving Miss Bingley and Mrs. Hurst to pick over their visit and to criticize the behavior of the Bennet family. But however hard they tried, they could not persuade Mr. Darcy to say anything rude about Elizabeth, in spite of all Miss Bingley's jokes about fine